Welcome to Still Unanswered. I'm Elena Maris. Today, we're digging into one of America's most haunting cold cases, the boy in the box. Until recently, literally America's unknown child. This is a story that spans decades, from a cold February day in 1957 in Northeast Philadelphia to a 2022 DNA breakthrough that finally gave him a name, Joseph Augustus Zarelli. But even with a name, many questions remain.
Hi, I'm Marcus Hu. As a forensic genealogist, I've followed cases like this closely, and Joseph's identification is a clear example of the ways modern science can restore identity to someone who was erased from the records. Still, it's important to remember that a name doesn't automatically equal answers about what happened, who was responsible, or why the boy vanished from family and official view for so long.
By the way, Marcus, before we get into the DNA and the modern work, I want to take listeners back to that discovery scene, Fox Chase, 1957. Picture a semi-rural fringe of Philadelphia, dirt tracks, scrubby woods, winter wind, folks using those spots as dumping grounds. The body was found in a cardboard box off Susquehanna Road. He was naked, wrapped in a faded plaid blanket, and placed inside a JCPenney bassinet box stamped fragile.
Yeah, Elena, the details of that scene still sit with me. The box itself was traced to a JCPenney store on 69th Street in Upper Darby, retail packaging that helped pin down a possible purchase timeline around Christmas 1956. The blanket had a Navajo-style design and looked recently laundered, which added this strange tension between apparent care and the clear evidence of severe chronic abuse.
Right. That tension is something I want us to hold on to throughout this episode. The boy measured about 40 inches and weighed only 30 to 40 pounds, underweight for a typical 4-year-old. He had bruises, healed broken ribs at different stages of healing, and the back of his skull had been smashed, blunt force trauma that ultimately caused his death. The medical examiner also noted that his hair had been crudely cropped into a homemade crew cut, and hair clippings were still on his torso.
It's those specifics that made this case both grotesque and strangely detailed in the files. Fingernails and toenails were trimmed and clean. One hand and both feet were pruned, as if immersed in water shortly before death. There were even scars, an L-shaped scar under the chin, a scar on the groin, possibly from a hernia operation, and a small ankle scar. All of this suggested a child who had received some grooming and possibly medical attention, yet who had endured chronic, severe abuse.
Exactly. And despite all those detailed physical clues, no one claimed him. No missing person report fit. The body sat in the city morgue for months. Detectives, a few funeral directors, and citizens raised money for a burial. And in July 1957, he was buried in a potter's field in Holmesburg, or America's unknown child.
That Potter's Field burial is a critical piece of the story, Elena. It speaks to the institutional reality of the time. When a child had no identified next of kin, the city had to step in to provide a burial. Yet even with a funeral and a grave, there was still no name, no family stepping forward. And the case went on as the city's oldest open cold case for generations.
Let's pause there. Marcus, can you walk listeners through the earliest people who found the box? 2 young men, Frederick Freddie Benonis and John Powroznik, saw the box under different circumstances, and their hesitant reactions shaped the timeline. Freddie was a LaSalle College junior who said he thought the figure was a doll at first. He saw it days earlier, but didn't call police until later. John, an 18-year-old student, actually saw the body before Freddie, but told no one initially.
Those human hesitations matter. In the 1950s, walking into a dumping ground and seeing something that might be a doll, or might be a child, produces a kind of cognitive denial. Both boys were frightened and shocked. One went home and didn't tell. The other returned later after hearing a news bulletin about a missing girl in New Jersey. Both passed polygraphs and were cleared, but their delayed reporting influenced how preserved the scene and the remains were when police finally arrived.
It's an unbearably ordinary element of the story, isn't it? Fear, confusion, not wanting to get involved. But it's also one of those small human moments that can shape a case. Moving into investigative response, 1957 was a very different era of police work. The city poured resources into identifying the child. Thousands of circulars, tens of thousands of mailings, and astonishingly, 300,000 circulars inserted with utility bills. Images of the boy and the blanket became everywhere in Philadelphia.
That scale of distribution was unprecedented for the time. Flyers went to physicians, police departments across states, orphanages, schools, and hospitals. Photographs were sent to train stations, liquor stores, and drugstores, a grassroots effort to crowdsource recognition in an era before digital databases or national missing person systems. They even created a wax head reconstruction, trying to give a lifelike face to the boy they were trying to identify.
And yet, despite hundreds of tips, 500 letters, and over 100 attempted identifications, nothing matched. By April 1957, investigators had followed up leads and ruled them out. It's almost hard to imagine today, so many eyes on a face and still no family. Marcus, how does that sit with you from a forensic perspective?
It's troubling and also explainable in several ways. A 4-year-old wouldn't be in fingerprint databases, and if that child had been kept out of institutions, schools, and healthcare systems, no vaccination scars were found, for example, there might be no administrative trail to follow. The lack of centralized missing child records in the 1950s made it feasible for a child to vanish from official view, even if people around him knew about him privately.
So the idea that he could be unclaimed, the boy had been so erased from the civic record that even though thousands saw his image, no family recognized or stepped forward. That silence is one of the central mysteries, which brings us to the many theories investigators chased over the years. I want to go through a few. The Hungarian refugee theory, the kidnapped Long Island boy idea, carnival workers, institutional abuse, and perhaps the most emotionally charged, M. Marcus, can you summarize how those theories fit both evidence and social anxieties of their times?
Sure. Each theory reflected a different worry. The Hungarian refugee idea came from post-war migration patterns, people asking whether he was an immigrant child whose disappearance wasn't documented. The Long Island kidnapping link and carnival worker theories were attempts to find an external origin or transient perpetrators. Institutional or foster home theories leaned on the haircut and scars, signifiers of institutional care. And the M story, well, that touches on trauma, memory, and the possibility of concealed family abuse.
Let's spend some time on M. This was an Ohio woman who contacted investigators decades later with a detailed story that she believed explained the boy's death. She said her mother bought a young boy in 1954, kept him in the basement, abused him, and in a rage killed him. She described cutting his hair and disposing of the body, which, on the surface, seemed to align with the crime scene details. But investigators ultimately could not corroborate her claims. Marcus, how should listeners interpret a story like that?
It's complex. On one hand, M provided specific details not widely publicized, which made some investigators take her seriously. On the other hand, memory is not a perfect archive. Trauma can fragment or conflate experiences. By the time she came forward, key people either were dead or unreachable, and there were no documents proving that kind of purchase of a child. After Joseph was identified, DNA evidence didn't clearly support all facets of M's narrative. So it remains an intriguing but unproven lead, more a reflection of how trauma survivors can interweave personal history with public mysteries than a solved connection.
Yeah, and that raises a theme we'll keep returning to: silence versus remembrance. M's story illustrates how a survivor's testimony can be both powerful and fraught. Okay, shift forward a bit. the case never died because of a combination of institutional persistence and public fascination. The Vidocq Society played a big role in the 1990s, funding an exhumation in 1998 and pushing the case back into public attention. Marcus, tell us about the significance of that exhumation.
The 1998 exhumation was hugely significant. After 41 years in a potter's field, a tooth and other remains were sampled to try to extract DNA with then-current technologies. Back then, the ability to generate a usable profile was limited and databases were sparse, so it didn't immediately lead to identification. But the exhumation had another impact. It reburied the boy at Ivy Hill Cemetery with more dignity and renewed attention from media and cold case groups, maintaining public memory and encouraging future scientific investment.
And then, 2 decades later, in 2019, investigators again exhumed the remains with much more advanced DNA methods. That's where your field, Marcus, really comes in. Can you walk listeners through the breakthrough process that led to the name Joseph Augustus Zarelli?
Yes, the 2019 exhumation allowed extraction of a higher quality DNA sample, and investigators were able to produce a profile suitable for investigative genetic genealogy. That means uploading a non-forensic DNA profile to public genealogy databases to look for matches, distant relatives, cousins who may have uploaded their DNA. In Joseph's case, a cousin had uploaded a profile, and genealogists traced family trees through records, births, obituaries, historical documents, until they narrowed down a likely child who matched sex, age, and regional history. That culminated in the 2022 public identification.
On December 8, 2022, Philadelphia police announced the boy's name, Joseph Augustus Zarelli, born January 13, 1953. His biological parents were identified as Mary Elizabeth Plunkett and Augustus John Zarelli. Marcus, from the genealogical evidence and police statements, what was confirmed and what remained uncertain after the announcement?
What was confirmed, multiple DNA matches on both maternal and paternal lines, court-ordered birth records linking the DNA profile to a recorded birth certificate, and thus Joseph's identity. What remained uncertain, who legally had custody of him prior to his death, exactly where he lived in the months and years before 1957, and who inflicted the fatal injuries. Prosecutorial and historical challenges remain because many potential witnesses and suspects are deceased, and contemporaneous records are sparse.
So we come to a tragic paradox. Technology finally restored a name, but legal closure, charging and prosecuting a killer, has not followed. As of early 2026, no one has been charged. Marcus, why is that so difficult even after identification?
There are several reasons. Time is the fundamental enemy of criminal prosecution. Memories fade, witnesses pass away, evidence degrades. Key potential perpetrators, including biological parents, were deceased. Also, even with identity, connecting a named person directly to the homicide requires contemporaneous corroborative evidence, records, eyewitnesses, or physical evidence proving custody and culpability that simply may not exist after 70 years. So investigators can identify the victim without having the procedural and evidentiary threads needed to charge someone.
It's heartbreaking. I also want to underline for listeners how the case shifted in public meaning over the decades. Joseph, previously America's unknown child, became a symbol for all unnamed, abused, and murdered children. Ivy Hill Cemetery even adopted his grave. People leave toys and flowers. Do you think that symbolic weight influenced the decision to continue investing in forensic work, Marcus?
Absolutely. When a case becomes public property, when so many people feel invested, it attracts resources, volunteer expertise like the Vidocq Society, media attention, and political will. That persistent public interest kept the case on detectives' desks. It kept pressure on labs and genealogists to re-examine evidence when technologies matured. Symbolism can motivate scientific effort, which in Joseph's case led to restoration of his name.
Let's talk about the ethical side for a moment.
Marcus, you work in this field. Use of public genealogy databases by law enforcement has stirred debate. Privacy, consent, and the question of implicating relatives. How does Joseph's case fit into that conversation?
It's a textbook example of the tension. On one side, investigative genetic genealogy has extraordinary power to identify nameless victims and unknown perpetrators. It brings answers to families and solves cold crimes. On the other side, people who uploaded their DNA for Ancestry may not have anticipated law enforcement usage, and relatives can be swept into investigations because of shared genetics. The ethics demand transparent policies, clear consent frameworks, and oversight so that the life-affirming uses, like returning a name to a boy buried as unknown, are balanced against privacy rights.
And there's another social lesson here. The 1950s systems for tracking children were weak. No national centralized database, patchy record keeping, and social norms that kept domestic abuse private. The case demonstrates how a child could be born, possibly outside formal acknowledgement, passed into informal custody, and then vanish. Marcus, do you see modern parallels we should be worried about?
Yes. Even today, children can fall through administrative cracks, unlicensed rehoming, informal childcare arrangements, and communities that lack reporting incentives. While we have better systems, school records, vaccination requirements, digital footprints, there remain gaps. The lesson is to maintain robust child welfare oversight, encourage reporting, and keep channels open for anonymous tips. Joseph's case is a historical warning that invisibility can persist without vigilance.
We should also reflect on how investigators over the years sometimes read different meanings into the same evidence. Early police noted his neat and clean grooming and inferred neat and clean parents, while the medical findings showed chronic abuse. That contradiction, careful grooming plus severe injuries, fueled many theories. Perhaps someone tried to erase identifiers, or perhaps the grooming was part of the abusive pattern. Marcus, what do those mixed signals tell us forensically?
Mixed signals require cautious interpretation. Clean nails and a recent haircut could indicate someone trying to present the child as cared for, or alternately, an abuser oscillating between grooming and violence. Surgical scars suggest some medical contact, but lack of vaccination scars suggests no routine pediatric care. Forensically, contradictions highlight that human behavior around abuse is not monolithic. People can display care in some domains and brutality in others. It complicates constructing a single explanatory narrative without corroborating records.
Right. And it's a reminder not to jump to conclusions. Always look for corroboration. Let's walk listeners through the major investigative operations that kept the case alive. The massive poster campaigns, the exhumations in 1998 and 2019, the involvement of organizations like the Vidocq Society, and sustained media coverage. Those moves, collectively, kept the case from fading into oblivion.
Each of those steps created layers of preservation. The circulars generated public memory. The 1998 exhumation preserved tissue for future testing. The Vidocq Society provided funding and expertise, and repeated media coverage ensured that when DNA technology advanced, there were personnel and public interest ready to act. In many cold cases, it's the accumulation of small investments and persistent attention that makes a technological breakthrough meaningful when it arrives.
Let me ask you this, Marcus. Do you think if the case had been left entirely untouched in the 1960s through the 1990s, the identification in 2022 would still have been possible?
Possibly not. The 1998 exhumation likely preserved or allowed the collection of material that may otherwise have been degraded or become inaccessible. Continuous chain of custody and intervening efforts made a 2019 re-exhumation more productive, so the layered attention increased the odds of a viable DNA profile decades later. Without that ongoing preservation and scientific interest, the window for identification might have closed entirely.
That is an important point. Small actions, fundraising for a burial, asking for reburial, exhuming for testing, accumulate into the possibility of later breakthroughs. I want to return to the family's reaction after the name announcement. Reports suggested some relatives learned of Joseph only from the news. That raises painful questions about family secrets and whether his parents knew or acknowledged him. Marcus, how do investigators handle living relatives in these moments?
With great care and trauma-informed practice, investigators must balance the needs of the investigation with respect for privacy and the emotional well-being of relatives who may be learning about a lost kin under very public circumstances. Police often ask for cooperation, but also issue requests for privacy. Forensic genealogists similarly try to avoid sensationalism. Our role is reconstructive and evidentiary, not accusatory. It's a delicate, ethical terrain.
And it's worth underscoring that while DNA identified a family line, it doesn't automatically reveal what family members knew or why they didn't act. We have to avoid rushing into moral judgments without evidence. Now, listeners will ask, is there hope that a killer will be charged? The straightforward answer, it's difficult. As of early 2026, no charges have been filed. The main hurdles are time, deaths of potential suspects, and lack of corroborating evidence.
Yes, while identification helps narrow investigative focus, prosecutors need admissible evidence relating a particular suspect to the crime beyond reasonable doubt. That typically requires documentation, living witnesses, or physical evidence linking a named person to custody or to the scene, things the case may not have. So, while the identification is justice of a sort, restoring a name, it may not yield legal justice in terms of prosecution.
There's another angle we should cover: memory and trauma. M's story illustrates how a survivor's recollections can both help and complicate an investigation. How should law enforcement and journalists treat such accounts, Marcus?
With empathy and verification. Trauma survivors' accounts deserve respect and careful listening because survivors can hold lead-worthy details. But investigators must also corroborate those accounts whenever possible, recognizing that memories can be influenced by time, suggestion, or media coverage. Trauma-informed interviewing techniques and avoiding leading questions are critical to preserve accuracy while honoring the survivor's experience.
I appreciate that nuance. Okay, toward the end of our episode, I want to reflect on legacy. Joseph's case changed public conversation about child protection, cold case techniques, and the ethical use of genetic genealogy. It also forces us to ask, what is closure? For families and communities, is giving him a name closure enough, or is justice required? Marcus.
Both answers are true. Giving Joseph a name restored individual dignity and provided relatives with a factual anchor. That matters enormously. But for many, legal accountability is also a form of moral closure. Without it, the emotional and civic wound remains partially open. Real closure often comes in layers: identification, public acknowledgement, understanding of the circumstances, and, when possible, accountability. Joseph's case gave one crucial layer, but not all.
And in the meantime, the grave marker at Ivy Hill continues to draw visitors and toys. There's debate about whether to change the headstone that once called him America's unknown child to his real name. Some suggest keeping the inscription as a symbol while adding his name. I'm curious, Marcus, what do you think the right balance is between symbolic memory and historical specificity?
I lean toward both. Retaining the symbolic inscription preserves the collective memory and the cases it represents, other nameless children, and adding his name restores his personal identity. It's both symbol and person. He can be a universal reminder and a singular life. In practice, many memorials evolve to honor both dimensions, keeping the symbol while ensuring the individual is not flattened into an icon.
Listeners, we should also be practical here. If you have information about cold cases, tips still matter. Joseph's case shows that even small memory fragments can become crucial decades later. Marcus, a final technical question for listeners who are curious. How does a genealogist approach building a family tree from a partial DNA match?
In simple terms, start broad, then narrow. You identify shared segments or estimated centimorgans of DNA that indicate relationship distance, second cousin, third cousin, and so on. From there, you build family trees using public records, birth, marriage, death certificates, census data, obituaries. You triangulate multiple matches to find a common ancestor, then work forward in time to identify descendants who could be immediate family. It's painstaking detective work that combines biology and archival research.
Thank you. Concise and clear. Before we close, Marcus, one more personal reflection. After working on these kinds of cases, what sticks with you?
What stays with me is how fragile identity can be without documentation, and how powerful it is to restore a name. It's also a reminder that every technological advance carries moral responsibility. When we return a name to someone like Joseph, we must do so with humility, respect for living relatives, and an understanding that science can mend only so much. The human stories and the failures of systems are the harder parts to heal.
I couldn't agree more. For me, Joseph's story is about refusing to let a life be anonymous, refusing to let a child be reduced to a photograph. The city of Philadelphia and countless volunteers refused to forget him. Their persistence ultimately made a DNA breakthrough meaningful. But we also must face the painful realities. His death was horrific, and many questions remain unanswered about who harmed him and why.
And that's precisely why cases like this matter beyond true crime curiosity. They force us to examine our social systems, child welfare, record keeping, medical access, and to consider how silence and secrecy enable abuse. They also remind us of the tangible power of science when paired with persistent human effort.
We're almost at the end, but I want to leave listeners with some concrete steps. If you suspect abuse or have historical information about a cold case, please report it to local police or submit a tip to cold case units. Be mindful of trauma survivors, approach with care, and encourage professionals to use trauma-informed channels. And remember, small memories matter. Marcus, final word?
If you've submitted DNA to a public site, know that your data can help identify victims and suspects, so consider your privacy settings and the terms of service. And above all, support policies that balance privacy with the potential for life-restoring identifications. Science can help, but it works best when the community, survivors, and systems commit to doing the right things.
Thank you, Marcus. To close, Joseph Augustus Zarelli was born January 13, 1953, and died in February 1957. For 65 years, he was buried as America's Unknown Child. On December 8, 2022, he was finally named. That name restores him to history, but it does not solve every mystery. We owe him honesty, dignity, and a continued pursuit of answers. Thank you for listening.
Thanks, Elena, and thanks to listeners for staying with us through this difficult story. If you want to learn more, the episode notes include source material, news articles, police releases, and historical reporting. Please remember the sensitivities here. Living relatives deserve privacy and respect, and many questions remain open. Take care of each other.
One last thing. If this episode felt heavy, you're not alone. These stories are hard because they're about children. If you or someone you know needs help, please reach out to local child protective services or hotlines in your area. Don't look away. We'll be back next week with another case on Still Unanswered. Until then, I'm Elena.
And I'm Marcus. Goodbye.